So I changed my instance data back to private, so I'm not violating encapsulation. Now what I want to do is set up two public methods to get and set my quiz grade. I'll do the getters and setters for the other variables later, but right now I just want to focus on the quiz grade. So here are my getter and my setter for my quiz grade. Now the getters and setters, they do follow a pattern. So whenever you create a getter, it's always going to be public. It should be public because you want to allow access through the object. You're going to return the exact same data type for the variable that this is working on. So we're using a quiz. Our quiz is declared to be a float, so I'm going to return a float. We will use get, and this typically follows a pattern and the name of the variable that we want to get. And then we're going to use the reserve word return. That just tells Java that we want to return the variable quiz that we declared up here. For the setter, we're going to use public because public says that this can be accessed through an instance of this object. Void is the return type. So whenever we're not returning anything, we're going to use void, and that just tells Java that nothing is being returned from this method. Then we're going to use set. Okay, so this follows a design pattern. We're always going to put set and then the name of our variable. Now inside of the parentheses, I'm using float val. This is going to be a placeholder for the data that's going to be passed into the set method, and then I'm taking that value and I'm assigning it to my quiz grade. So I'm actually modifying my quiz grade with this setter method. Now notice that the get quiz does not have any data inside of his parentheses, so that just means whenever I invoke the get quiz method, I don't have to pass any data to it. But whenever I invoke the set quiz method, I'm going to pass in the value that I want to change my quiz grade to. So let me demonstrate how this works. So here's my driver class, and I made a simple output statement where I'm just going to get the quiz grade of the object that I just instantiated up here. I'm using my object reference variable and I'm calling the method get quiz. I'm not passing any data inside of my parentheses. If you go back to the method header for this quiz grade, you can see that I'm not passing any data. That's just the way that I created my blueprint class to not take any data. So over here, I'm not taking any data. Now it's important to note that this method does return a float because in my blueprint class, I said that a float value is going to come out of this method. So we can actually assign the value that comes out of this method to a float variable if you wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And here is my output. Notice how my quiz grade is 0. And the reason it's 0 is because I never set this value anywhere. So now what I'm doing is I'm setting my quiz grade to 89. I'm invoking this method through my object reference variable and I'm calling set quiz and I'm passing in a float. Now this is actually an integer, but if you look back to my blueprint, I specified that a float should come in here. Now because a float is of 32 bits and an integer is of 32 bits, an integer has less resolution. By less resolution, I mean there's no decimal point in a fraction part. Passing in an integer is okay. Java's okay from converting an integer to a float. Then I'm outputting the data once more. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. And there is my result. So you can see that I was able to change my quiz grade to 89. Now, one thing I wanted to show you is this method is not returning any value. If you look at the blueprint, it's void. So what do you think will happen if I try to concatenate this to a string? Let's find out. I created this output statement to test what will happen if I try to concatenate this method to a string. Now notice in the method header for the return type, I put void. So that's telling Java that nothing is going to be returned from this method. So I'm going to go ahead and compile. You can see that Java is upset. It knows that the method return type is void. So that means that you cannot capture that value and concatenate it to a string or assign it to some variable. So whenever you specify void as your return type, the method has to be called by itself on its own line, like what I did on line 19. Okay, so one more test. I went ahead and passed in 10,000 to my quiz grade. And let's see what happens when I compile and run this program. And you can see that my quiz grade got set to 10,000. Now the whole reason I made the quiz variable private is so that I can enforce encapsulation. We talked about encapsulation here. So what's happening is 10,000 is being passed into the set quiz grade method. So I don't have any filtering or any rules that prevent my quiz grade from being set to something that doesn't make sense. Now the whole reason for using encapsulation is to prevent things like this from happening. Now to prevent your data from being set to a value that doesn't make sense, we can use an if statement to protect the integrity of our data. So I created this if statement, and what this is going to do, it's going to prevent my quiz grade from being set to a value that is not within the range of 0 and 100. Now we're going to talk about if statements in chapters 5 and 6. So this is something that you don't have to do when we're in chapter 4, but to me, it makes more sense if you do this within your setters because it's the whole purpose of encapsulation. But I'm going to start using these in my demonstrations. You don't have to use them. I'm not going to take off points if you don't use them. But once we get to chapter 5 and 6, then I'm going to want you to start using if statements. So now that that I'm using a filter to prevent my quiz grade from being set to a value outside the range of 0 to 100, whenever I compile and run this program, this value should be ignored. So I'm going to go ahead and test this. And you can see on my last line, I try to pass in a 10,000, but because I have a filter, that got ignored because it was outside of my range and my grade stayed 89. Let's see what happens if I go below my range. So now I'm trying to change the quiz grade to negative 999. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. In my if statement that's doing my filtering, prevented that grade from being set to negative 999. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this filter while I talk about the rest of this program. So I want to go ahead and finish the rest of this class. So I need to create getters and setters for my instance data. I've already did it for quiz. I need to do it for these 3 variables. Now, one thing that I did that was wrong is I included this as a variable. Now, the reason why this shouldn't be instance data is because it's calculated based off of these parameters. I'll go ahead and leave this in for now so I can talk more about it later when I create a method for it. But for now, I want to focus on creating getters and setters for assignment, midterm, and final exam. So I'm going to follow the same pattern that I did here, except the method names and the statements inside the methods are going to change for the accommodation of what these values are. So I created getters and setters for assignment, midterm, and final grade. So here is my getters and setters. Now notice how they all kind of follow the same pattern because they are the same type, float. And then here are my setters. They follow the same pattern as I did for quiz because they're also of the type float. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the getters and setters for my first name and for my last name. So I created the getters and setters for my first and my last name. So here are the getters. Now notice that the thing that is different is that I'm returning a string. And for the last name, the thing that is different is I'm taking in a string. So this is where they pass in a string. I'm going to set the string they pass in to my first name and take the string that they pass in as my last name. So now that I have variables to get and set all my data, I need to go ahead and calculate my final grade. Anything that can be calculated should not have instance data. So this is actually something that I did wrong. Some students make this mistake a lot. So just keep in mind, if it can be calculated based on another instance data, then it should not be instance data. And the reason for that, since final grade is based off of these 4 values, anytime one of these grades change, we have to change the final grade for the course. Now that's just too much overhead for us to do. So what we can do is remove this variable and simply just make a service that's going to calculate our final grade whenever it's requested. And by service, I mean a method. Below my getters and setters, I'm going to make a new method to calculate and return my final grade. So here's my method for my final grade. It's simply just my equation that I used in the previous grade calculator, where I take each of the grades, multiply it to its percentage, and then sum them up. And when I invoke this method final grade, it's going to return a float, and then I can display the final grade by just invoking this method. Here's my grade 2 calculator program. I'm going to go ahead and modify this to look exactly like my previous calculator program, except instead of managing all the data within this driver class, I'm simply just going to use a student object, and I'm going to do all the managing within the student object. Before I change my grade calculator 2, let's look at the previous grade calculator. Notice how I have all this data here that I'm managing. I went ahead and moved all that into the student class, and I'm still going to prompt inside of this driver class, but I'm going to store the data into my student object. This grade calculation here for the final grade, that's also going to be done in my student class. Now, one thing I didn't do, and I should probably do this, is make a display method that is going to output this exact same display. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, it's important to remember that you should not use system outs inside of Blueprint classes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a method that is going to return a string that looks exactly like this. So before I modify my grade calculator 2 program, I'm going to go ahead and update my student class. So here's a method that I created that creates a string that is going to help us output a neat display. I basically just copied the same format. Now this does have to be a string because we don't want to use system out print lines within our Blueprint class. We just want to return a string. So here is my method, grade summary. Notice that this method returns a string. I declare a string here. The string that I declare here is going to be returned out of this method with the return statement. Now I'm using string format. Now we talked about string format in chapter 3. I'm not sure how often I used it. No, I do use it a lot in chapter 4. So the first thing that we pass into the string format is a string, and what's highlighted is the entire string. Now I did concatenate a lot, and the reason I did that is because it just looks neater to look at. When I'm wanting to format a string, I can see all the lines strings that I'm going to have. And then whenever I have these flags here, I know that's where data needs to be injected. So for the first 2 strings that I'm going to inject, it's going to be first name and last name. And then I have all my floats for quiz, assignments, midterm, final exam, and final course grade. So those are my 4. And then my final grade is actually through a method, the final grade method. So I'm invoking that method here, and it's going to return that float by doing this calculation right there. So now that I have this method here, I'm going to go ahead and work on my Grade Calculator 2 program to be similar to what I did in my original Grade Calculator program, except I'm going to use a student object. So here's my program. I have the same prompts that I did for the original Grade Calculator program. So the prompts will stay within my driver class, except I'm now managing the data in my student object. When I get my string for my first name, I'm going to pass it directly to my student object by calling set first name. Do the same thing for last name and the quiz grade, assignment grade, midterm grade, final grade. And then once I have all that data inside of my object, all that data has been set, then I can simply just call grade summary and I can output the grade for that student. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program. I'm going to enter in my data. Here's the data that I entered, and here's the output for my grade summary. So what I did in Grade Calculator 2 is I essentially just moved all this data management to its own class for student, and I did have to create methods in order to make that happen. Now I know I seem like this is a lot of extra work, but think about this. Okay, so for a program that's going to calculate the grade for one student, it does make sense to do something like this. Now if I were to ask you to make a program that does this for 20 students, we can simply just use my student class, which is the blueprint, to create 20 student objects, and those objects in memory are going to manage their own data. All I need to do is just pass in the data that the user enters to those objects, and then whenever I want to get the grade, I could just invoke the methods like final grade, and when I want to get the summary, I can just invoke methods like grade summary. Now there is a few more things that I want to demonstrate on our student class, and one of them is the toString method.